Hey everybody, today I'm out in San Francisco with the all-new 2024 Mazda CX-90. This is the three-row crossover that puts the Zoom Zoom back in the former Zoom Zoom brand. I'm actually surprised that Mazda hasn't resurrected that tagline because this CX-90 is a rear-wheel drive-based all-wheel drive crossover with an inline-6 engine under the hood and nearly 400 horsepower, or if you're so inclined, there's also going to be a plug-in hybrid version available. If you want to check out that video, that's going to be over on the EV Buyer's Guide channel. In this video, I'm going to talk about why you might want to get the CX-90 over really everything else in this segment, and why you might even want to choose one of these over an Acura MDX and look at it as a value alternative to a BMW X7. It almost goes without saying it, the CX-90 is a handsome vehicle, and that's something that we've long associated with Mazda. We have a very familiar front-end design, very similar to the rest of the Mazda lineup, but it has been tweaked a little bit. The headlights are a little bit chunkier, the grille is a little bit different right here, and it doesn't have a chrome bar on the top. Instead, the body color portions wrap right around there. These are full LED headlights, and if you get the top-end trims, they steer in the corners. Mazda pulled out all the engineering stops with the new CX-90. This rides on an all-new platform shared with no other Mazda except for the European market CX-60 and CX-80. Coming a little bit later, there's also going to be a CX-70 for the US that's probably going to be more or less a two-row version of this vehicle. It's wider than the outgoing CX-9, so they've done a lot of aerodynamic work to make this sleeker. We have active grille shutters behind this large grille right there, and then these air intakes right here on each side. Those help create an air curtain around the vehicle to help improve aerodynamics. The new platform is what gives the CX-90 the luxury car presence that you're seeing here, with this extremely long hood profile. And it's here for the exact same reason we find long hoods in BMWs, because there's an inline-6 engine sitting long ways in the engine bay. And you'll notice how long this hood is. I can't even reach the end of that hood from here. It is a very long hood profile. The long hood profile is decidedly elegant, and if you're in the market for an MDX, or perhaps you're waiting for a Lexus TX, the Lexus three-row SUV that's coming soon, you probably would do well to take a look at the CX-90. This is going to drive very differently than either of those options, and Mazda has really done a lot of work on the inside, which we'll take a look at in a bit, to help convince luxury shoppers to give Mazda a second look. But there's also a mainstream priced option, which is another interesting twist. So price-wise, this is going to start right around the Highlander and Pilot, but then go on up to MDX and Lexus-like pricing. But unlike a Pilot, this is quite a bit longer, about 200.8 inches long. So very similar in terms of its dimensions to the Grand Cherokee L for the same reason. We have that long hood profile up front. And like the Grand Cherokee L, we have a third row and a second row that are a little bit smaller than you might think based on the exterior dimensions. This is definitely longer than a Telluride or a Palisade, but we have about 5 or 6 inches less legroom inside, for again, the same reasons that we find a similar sized interior in the Grand Cherokee. As you'd expect out of a more performance-oriented offering, we have 21-inch wheels, 275 width tires, 45 aspect ratio. These are pretty meaty tires, and these are certainly wider than anything you'll find on a Highlander or a Pilot. We have 8.1 inches of ground clearance, which is pretty reasonable for a three-row crossover, but keep in mind that the wheelbase is very long, nearly 123 inches. The one angle that is a bit controversial as far as design is this one, because we definitely have a very rounded profile out back. Some have said it's a little bit egg-shaped. I'd love to know what you think down there. I'm okay with it, but I do think that something a bit sharper and more angular would have been more attractive. You'll also notice that in order to try and keep the dimensions as short as possible, even with that extremely long hood up front, there isn't much of a bumper out back. In order to accommodate those wide tires, you can see that the body has a little bit of a hip profile, which I find attractive. Again, let me know what you think. We have full LED taillight modules back here, which is surprising, bearing in mind this starts under $40,000. So while some folks might consider this an MDX or a TX competitor, this is also solidly a Telluride, a Palisade, a Pilot, a Highlander, etc., etc., etc. competitor. I'm really going to be interested to see how the CX-90 sells, because the CX-9 hasn't sold well for reasons that I have never fully understood, and I really hope this reverses that trend. Under the hood is where things get really interesting. Bucking the trend of small displacement turbocharged engines, Mazda has given us a fairly large displacement turbocharged engine, and it's an inline six again. It's a 3.3 liter turbo inline six, so a little bit larger displacement than you'll find in the average BMW or Mercedes. But like a Mercedes, this engine is sitting long ways in the engine bay. It starts right around here, and the engine actually ends just about under the windshield glass. That means that a decent portion of the engine is behind the front axle, giving this a near perfect 50-50 weight balance. Even more interesting, this engine is standard. Mazda decided not to start with a naturally aspirated four-cylinder or one of their older turbo fours. Instead, the 3.3 liter turbo is in every single trim except for the plug-in hybrid model. Now, the 3.3 liter turbo does come in two different power levels, 280 horsepower and 340 horsepower with up to 369 pound-feet of torque. Because the bulk of the engine design is the same, you can bet that some aftermarket tuning companies are going to be able to squeak even more power out of this engine at some later date. Also an interesting twist, all CX-90s are going to be at least a mild hybrid. This engine is paired with a 16 horsepower electric motor that produces 113 pound-feet of torque, and it's situated right back there in the engine bay between the engine and the transmission. The motor is on board not just to improve fuel economy, but to allow Mazda to delete the torque converter. Yes, you heard that right. This vehicle has an 8-speed automatic without a torque converter. According to Mazda, that makes the transmission a little bit smaller, enabled the narrower packaging in the cabin to give you more legroom up front, and also helps improve fuel economy. There's a teeny tiny battery in the vehicle. It's a 1/3 kilowatt hour battery, and then up front, there's also an 11 kilowatt motor generator unit. Now, if you're interested in saving more gasoline, you could get the 2.5 liter plug-in hybrid system. That combines a naturally aspirated four-cylinder engine sitting in the same orientation with essentially the same 8-speed automatic transmission and a much bigger electric motor. The elegant thing about these drivetrains is that the design is fairly consistent. The big thing with the plug-in hybrid is that it gets a much bigger battery pack, 17.8 kilowatt hours. Again, if you want to know more about that, there is a complete video, but in essence, that vehicle will give you 26 miles of all-electric range and fairly similar fuel economy to the 3.3 liter turbo. Pretty much every CX-90 is going to average about 25 miles per gallon. Maximum towing capacity comes in at 5,000 pounds. I had hoped that this would be maybe 6 or perhaps even 7,000 pounds towing capability because of its rear-wheel drive layout, but apparently Mazda has decided to prioritize the driving dynamics and of course the fuel efficiency of these drivetrains. Likely that torque converter delete is one of the reasons that we don't find a higher towing ability. You will find a few 3-row crossovers with 6,000 pounds and a very limited number out there with 7,000 or more. As we look around the interior, it's important to keep in mind that Mazda's price tag is more premium than luxury in this fully loaded model. This tops out right around $61,000, $62,000, so we don't find additional seat adjustability that you would find in a high-end BMW or Mercedes. So the driver's seat has two-way adjustable lumbar support only, no adjustable lumbar support at all for the front passenger seat in any trim. We do, however, have a powered tilt telescopic steering column, something you certainly won't find in a Highlander, 2-position memory over here for the driver's side. I found this seat to be quite comfortable, and the seating position is definitely very upright. Decent amount of headroom here. This model has the panoramic moonroof, but I still have about 3 inches of headroom left. Now let's check out the rear seats. You'll first notice that the doors open really wide, almost 90 degrees. That's going to make it a lot easier to get children or child seats, things like that in here. And let's go for a spin. This particular model is one of the 6-seat varieties of CX-90, so we get captain's chairs in the second row. They have a pretty decent recline. They also get pretty upright if you want to square off the cargo area. They slide manually forward and backward, giving you a reasonable amount of room to get back there in the third row, even with a child seat anchored into place. If I move over to this side, you will notice that this model has a fixed-in-place center console. Not all CX-90s will get this. There are a variety of different interior options, again, 6, 7, and 8-seat versions with and without the fixed center console. I wish this was removable. We do have some additional storage and cup holders and little storagey areas in here that we're going to take a look at, but it doesn't come out of the vehicle easily. We do, however, in this model have heated and ventilated seats and climate controls back here for the second and third rows. It's a 3-zone system. Now, because of the rear-wheel drive design of the CX-90, you will notice that the floor of the second row is not flat, so we do have a much larger hump right there than you'll find in any of the competition. That's just because of the more dynamic design of the drivetrain. Here's what the center console looks like. 2 air vents right there, USB charge ports, the 3-zone automatic climate control controls, and then the big cup holders right here for the second row. These are actually bigger than the ones up front. Now it's time for the third row test. You will notice that this does not have a second row seat mechanism that allows you to leave a child seat anchored into place, which is something we saw in the CX-9. However, this seat does slide pretty far forward, so you can just slide it forward like that and then still squeak through into the back. That's almost as handy as one of those articulated seat designs. Now I will move this other seat back in its tracks so you can get a better idea of what the legroom is like back here. Just over 111 inches of combined legroom means that this is certainly not going to be as accommodating as a Telluride. And you will notice that this seat bottom cushion is pretty close to the ground. However, headroom is quite generous. Sitting back here with my head on the headrest, this sort of defies the numbers that you see on the spec sheet. My hair is brushing the ceiling, but my head is not touching the ceiling. And this is only a two-person bench, so the two people back here are going to be pretty comfortable. Now, in case you're wondering about that three-person third row, here it is. There is a middle seat right here in the middle, and headroom, yes, it is a little tight right there in that middle seat position because it is slightly higher off the ground than the outboard seating positions. So if I'm on the outside, I have headroom. If I'm on the inside in the middle, not a lot's going on, but it has 8 seats or 7 seats, something that is a rarity in this segment. Third row passengers get USB-C charge ports, large cup holders well integrated into the side, but no soft touch armrests or anything like that. They do, however, have air vents down there on the bottom. Logically, another compromise because of that long hood is the cargo area in the back. Remember that size-wise and packaging and design-wise, this is a lot closer to a BMW X7 than a Toyota Highlander. I do think that this hatch could go a little bit higher. At 6 feet tall, I'm definitely bopping my head. But back here is going to be the problem for more shoppers. We get 14.9 to 15.9 cubic feet of cargo capacity, depending on the model you get. This 2-seat third row gives us the larger cargo area in the back. If you get the 3-seat row for the 8-passenger version or the 7-passenger version, then you'll get 14.9 cubic feet back here. But still a reasonable amount of storage area, and very similar to something like a Highlander. You will find more storage area, however, in the Pilot, the Telluride, etc. Looking under here, we find the tire iron, and then if I can lift this up out of the way, we do have a temporary spare tire, which is part of the reason that this cargo area seems a little bit smaller. They could have deleted that and given us more BMW-like cargo room, but unlike BMW, Mazda gives us a spare tire. Subwoofers right there in the middle. A lot of you were asking about this, but the third row seats are manual only in every trim. No version's going to have a powered seat. I think this is just fine because it is way faster to pull these up or put these down than a powered seat design. Also, you end up getting a little bit more cargo room because that power mechanism does take up some space. As you'd expect out of a vehicle riding on an all-new platform, the interior is full of all-new components for Mazda. Up here are the controls for this large panoramic moonroof. It spans just over the driver and front passengers' heads, all the way back there to the second row where Brian is sitting there. He has a reasonable amount of headroom, you can see right there. One unusual thing about this moonroof is that it does not open terribly far as the opening. This is only about 8 or 9 inches. That is as far as it will open. You'll notice that the glass is at quite a severe angle there to help reduce turbulence. The driver and front passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts, 2-way adjustable head restraints, and the rear passengers in this trim get integrated sunshades in the rear doors. There was some confusion on Facebook about which trim this is. This is the top-end version of the Turbo S. It is available in 2 different colors. This color and a light off-white color which uses maple wood trim on the doors and on portions of the dashboard. But this is also the top-end trim, and it's also that same price tag. In here, we get sort of a baseball glove-like brown leather with an imitation suede insert in the middle and then that black stripe running down the seat. It's a very attractive look, but again, that passenger seat is not as adjustable as the driver's seat. Now, if we move on over to the front doors, you'll notice that we don't get the wood trim that we find in that white interior model. We also don't get the same kind of stitching on the dashboard that we find in that model either, although this is still very, very elegant. The materials quality, the attention to detail, the assembly quality is certainly Lexus-like in this interior, which is not something that I was able to say about the CX-9, even though the materials were very nice. They weren't assembled quite as nicely as this. Now, logically, down at the bottom of the door, we do have hard plastics for durability right around that bottle holder right there. And you will notice a bit of a difference in terms of design and materials quality versus the luxury entries up here on the dashboard. We find a regular injection molded upper portion of the dashboard, nothing after stitched, no leather dashboard there. We then have the imitation suede portion of the dash right here. If you get the lighter interior color, there's a very eccentric stitch pattern here. This has much more of a, I guess, more mainstream stitch there with some piping in the middle. We then have hard plastics down at the bottom of the dashboard, not soft like you might find in a BMW, Lexus, or an Acura. And then moving on to the middle of the dashboard, we find the somewhat controversial large Mazda touchscreen infotainment system. Yes, touchscreen, but there's something important to know. The touchy part only works when we're talking about CarPlay or Android Auto. If, for instance, I go back here to the Mazda native interface, all of a sudden the touchscreen does absolutely nothing. And I do think that's a little bit weird. This is not running a newer version of the software versus what we find in the Mazda 3 or the Mazda CX-5, etc. It's basically a large screen, slightly updated version of that same software. So the functionality is very, very similar. Now down from there we have again more of that imitation suede upholstery there, engine start, stop button, the controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control. Those are the controls for the front 2 climate zones there. Physical buttons for the heated steering wheel, ventilated seats, etc. And then toggle switches up here, which really gives it an elegant feel. We have a Qi wireless charging mat right there. 2 somewhat shallow cup holders. I am surprised that the ones in the rear seat area are actually deeper than what's going on there. We have a joystick style shifter here with a bit of a twist. You'll notice that park is over here and it does mirror this pattern. There's an unlock button up front. We actually have to move it over and it stays there for reverse, down there for drive. For park, you push it up and then pull it over there, rather than having a separate button. This is the drive mode toggle right there. We have hill descent control, button for the 360-degree camera system, electronic parking brake. This is the big controller for that infotainment system. It works very much like some of the German options. Toggle there for the track forward, backward for the infotainment system, favorite button. And then a bifold split center armrest here. So we push the button there, and open it up. As you can see, it is a relatively shallow area. We really only have maybe about 1 key's worth of height in there because the rear-wheel drive transmission is, of course, located right here under the center console. This is what the key looks like. The buttons are on the side, a la Volvo. And as you can see over here, we have a center area that is a little bit wider than average for a mainstream crossover, but because Mazda has designed this transmission to be very narrow, it's not quite as bulky as far as that dash profile versus something like a Mercedes-Benz GLS. Not every version of the CX-90 will have a full LCD cluster, but this model does. Now, it's not very configurable. This is basically the only look you get. If I toggle the drive mode selector over to Sport, you can see that the theme barely changes at all. We just get the red accents there. If I move down to the off-road mode, you'll see that those accents will change again. The main way that the layout changes is if you engage the iActive Sense display. You'll notice that we get a digital speedometer right there in the middle and more of the active safety info, and then it will swipe back to that. We also get a lot of little accents around the instrument cluster gauge designs, but the gauge cluster itself remains basically either this design or the one with the active safety setup. Moving out from there, we have this very attractive and I must say quite Volvo-like two-tone steering wheel where the outside rim is charcoal, the inside rim matches the dashboard accents and the seats. This is a very elegantly apportioned interior. The steering wheel itself is somewhat similar to other Mazda models in that we have paddle shifters on the back that are relatively small along with those thin spokes there. The controls for the infotainment system are toggles over here for track and volume. We then have voice command phone buttons. The info button operates that multifunction LCD cluster. Then we have the controls for the adaptive cruise control over here on this side. The stalks, those are somewhat similar to other Mazda models as well. We have the windshield wipers, things like that over there, headlights and turn signals on the other side. Now, in case you're really wondering about that lighter interior, here's what's going on. So we have a fabric section up here, that hand stitching right there. We then get maple accents all across the interior, but we don't have the faux suede inserts on the seats themselves. So that's the big differentiator here. So all Napa leather here, wood there, fabric on the doors and on the dashboard. You can see it over here on the doors, but we don't get the faux suede. As we get the CX-90 out on the road, we need to talk about the design of this drivetrain first and how it works. So we have the engine, we have a clutch pack, we have the electric motor, then we have the transmission. No torque converter. A torque converter is the part of an automatic transmission that allows the engine to spin at one speed and the rest of the transmission to spin at a different speed whenever needed. This does not have that. So when you come to a complete stop, it opens the clutch, and then from 0 to just a few miles an hour, it actually has to use the electric motor to push the vehicle forward. So the engine is not able to make this vehicle move forward under its own power at very, very low speeds. That's why, depending on how you're driving the CX-90, this transmission will feel more like a dual clutch transmission. The shifts are pretty crisp, but the engagement can feel a little bit more aggressive than the average automatic transmission. And if you're driving more aggressively, say if I floor it here and then I let off the gas, you'll notice this more aggressive deceleration. That's because it hasn't opened that clutch back up yet. Now, on the other hand, this is a hybrid system, so it's going to help improve fuel economy in low speeds, in city driving, etc. And at lower speeds, you'll notice that the engine will turn off right around 25 or 26 miles an hour, and there is just a little bit of electric-only drive operation. So this is not a mild hybrid. This is a full hybrid standard with the plug-in hybrid system optional. Now, Mazda has used the term mild hybrid here and there to describe the CX-90's system. Technically, this would be a full hybrid, but they decided that they thought that people would be confused about that because this does not operate like a Prius. The electric-only operation is very, very limited, but it technically has one, which technically makes this a full hybrid. Now, this one is the high-output version of the inline six. Let's go ahead and see how the acceleration is. Again, as we start off, the electric motor is starting us out, then the engine kicks in. So you will definitely notice that the initial acceleration moment is a little bit muted compared to something like a BMW X7. And I know I keep making so many X7 comparisons in this video, but there is a rational reason for that. The design of this drivetrain is more like the X7, and size-wise, this is more like an X7 than a Highlander, a Pilot, etc., etc., etc. So that is the reason for the constant comparison here. But back to the transmission for a bit. Because of the design of this system with that clutch pack and no torque converter, this is not going to be quite as smooth as the ZF 8-speed that we find in the Grand Cherokee or, again, that BMW. It's also not going to be quite as smooth as the system that we find in the Pilot or the Highlander, especially the Highlander's hybrid system. Instead, this is going to feel more sporty, more engaging, more like a dual clutch transmission. So in that respect, this actually feels a bit more like certain Audi models as far as the way the shifts feel, the way the engine, the transmission, and everything else just goes together. Also, keep in mind, this is a rear-wheel drive biased all-wheel drive system. So even though the all-wheel drive system is always engaged, it's always trying to send some portion of power to the front, it is certainly sending the majority of the power to the rear. But out on a road like this definitely carves corners extremely well, and it has the Mazda steering feel that they've been known for a while. But in other Mazdas, the steering feel is combined with a little bit of torque steer and, a little bit of understeer, etc. In this, the handling is very, very neutral, very precise. And that means that this is quite simply one of the best driving three-row crossovers under about $60,000. There are just those considerations with transmission smoothness. Again, keep that in mind and let me know if that is something that concerns you down there in the comment section. Now, I don't have official 0 to 60 times or 60 to 0 stopping distances, but some folks have been able to do some preliminary testing out here, and it looks like these should run between 6 and about 6.5 seconds, depending on the version that you get. Any way you slice it, CX-90 is actually going to be fast on average for this segment, certainly faster than a base Highlander or Pilot, even with that less powerful turbocharged engine, and this model is going to be among the fastest entries. As far as the ride quality goes, I would say this is a little firmer than average, but it's not MDX Type S firm. We don't have adaptive dampers on the CX-90. I have to admit I was a little bit surprised that we don't have those in this top-end trim, but then again, this isn't as expensive as I had expected. You will certainly find much more expensive versions of the Grand Cherokee, etc. You will find adaptive dampers on some of the competition, like certain versions of the Explorer, but again, more expensive there as far as their MSRP. And that's really, I think, the thing to keep in mind with the CX-90. There are going to be things you'll find in the MDX, things you will likely find in that upcoming Lexus TX or the Grand Cherokee, etc. Those are more luxury-oriented vehicles, to be honest. But the price tag of this is less expensive, so I think that on balance, Mazda made exactly the right choice. Although part of me does wish that they had an everything package where they just threw everything they could possibly do in the kitchen sink into the CX-90. That would have just made it more expensive. But I digress. Let's get back to the ride quality. If I waggle the steering wheel here, you'll notice that we do get a little bit of body motion. Because this is big and heavy, it does kind of feel like the front end is moving at a slightly different rate than the rear. But all of the motions are very well controlled, and the rear suspension never gets upset over broken pavement. Dig deeper in the throttle, though, in the corners, and you will notice that the rear end really settles down, and you definitely get that rear end steering action that you'd expect in a rear-wheel drive biased vehicle. As far as cabin noise goes, I think that Mazda has done a really good job balancing things. Wind noise is especially well controlled, as is road noise, even though we do have those 275 width tires on this model. These tires are very wide for the segment. You will find slightly wider tires than something like a Durango SRT. That's not long for this world, or of course the Grand Cherokee, but outside of that, this is pretty much as wide as comes in this category. At this point in time, it's a bit difficult to talk about fuel economy because we haven't been driving this on our usual test loop, but so far we've been averaging about 22 miles per gallon. Now keep in mind, it did take us quite a long time to escape downtown San Francisco, and of course we've been playing with it out on these winding mountain roads, but fuel economy has actually been going up since we left the city. This hybrid system doesn't have the same mission as a Highlander hybrid, so it's not going to be a 30 mile per gallon hybrid. In some ways, the mission of this hybrid system was to enable the slimmer transmission casing, to enable the packaging and the performance characteristics that they were interested in, and also better integrate and have better synergies with the plug-in hybrid system in the CX-90, which is essentially the same transmission with a bigger electric motor and a smaller engine up front. Bottom lining the CX-90 out on Highway 1 is pretty easy. The ride quality is a pretty good balance between passenger comfort and driver fun when the road starts to wind like this. The directness of the drivetrain is definitely an asset for a road surface like this. The shifts are not quite as fast as a ZF 8-speed automatic. It does take a little bit to downshift there, but we get that very direct dual clutch-like transmission feel. Now, on the downside, in the city, you will also get a somewhat dual clutch-like feel because, again, we don't have that torque converter. So it's just a pro and con thing. You may like it, you may not like it, but you should definitely drive one of these to decide whether or not it's right for you. Now to the nitty-gritty. How much is the CX-90 going to cost you? I have to admit, I found Mazda's pricing shocking. And shocking in a good way, because when the CX-90 was released and I had my own predictions about price tags for this model, my price tags were off by about $10,000 to $15,000. This is going to start at $39,595, plus, of course, destination. That is going to get you the lower horsepower, just under 300 horsepower, 3.3 liter turbocharged inline 6, all-wheel drive is standard, and 8 seats, 3 in the second row, 3 in the way back. Interestingly, there are going to be a decent number of CX-90s actually with 8 seats. So if you're looking for something fun, something really attractive looking, and something that seats 8 people, this is going to be one of the few options. And you're not limited to just that base trim. You can get the preferred trim for $43,335, or the preferred plus trim for $45,900 with 8 seats, or even the base plug-in hybrid with 8 seats. Making, oddly enough, the CX-90 the only 8-seat thing in America with a plug that's not a full-size van. You won't get 8 seats in a Model X, you won't get 8 seats in a Rivian R1S, you won't even get 8 seats in the plug-in hybrid minivan that's on sale in the United States. That's 7-seat only. Now, most of the upper-end trims, of course, are going to start deleting seats. So by the time you work your way up to the upper-level trims of the plug-in hybrid or any of the Turbo S models, the seat count starts dropping. And the Turbo S, as we're looking at right here, is 6-seat only. 2 up front, 2 in the middle, and then 2 in the back. I was also surprised that Mazda bothered to design 2 different third rows for the CX-90, one that seats 2 and one that seats 3. The cargo area in the back does change a little bit based on whether you get the 2 or 3 seat setup, but it's not a huge deal. Now, speaking of Turbo S, this is going to be more expensive. It's going to start at $51,950 and go all the way up to $59,950. So basically about $61,000 after destination. Now, what I find interesting about that is that when you take a look at the feature content inside, the suede bits on the dashboard, the upgraded leather, the wood trim, the really attractive design on the inside, I had expected this to go up to about $75,000. And I'd honestly expected that plug-in hybrid to be at least 10 grand more than it actually is. Instead, this price tag is sticking really very close to something like the top-end versions of the Palisade, definitely less expensive than that Lexus TX is likely to be. And this is probably going to give you better performance. Without a doubt, I would buy the CX-90 over the MDX Type S. The MDX Type S has a reasonable amount of power, but because of its drivetrain design, it can't apply it as well as this vehicle does. 0 to 60 times are going to be fairly similar, but the feel of the vehicle is going to be quite different. Even though this doesn't have a torque vectoring axle in the rear, it will send more power to the rear most of the time versus the MDX, which can only send a bit more power to the rear than the front under very limited circumstances. This is able to do it anytime it wants. In fact, this is the opposite twist. This cannot send more than 50% of power to the front axle until the rear wheels slip. So dynamically, this is very, very different. And that's why when driving it, I kept going back to something like the GLS or the BMW X7. Size-wise, this is more GLS and X7 than Toyota Highlander, and driving dynamics-wise, it's also more similar to those models because of the drivetrain layout. Let me know what you think about it, and what would you cross-shop with the CX-90? Are you interested in having the driving dynamics over the bigger interior? Because that is still the one problem with the Mazda entry in the mainstream segment. Second row and third row are just not as big as some of the larger options, especially the new Grand Highlander or the Twinsies from Korea. Those are going to give you more legroom, considerably more legroom in the back than we find here. But this interior and the way that it drives is definitely head and shoulders above those options. Let me know down there in the comment section, and stay tuned because hopefully I will have one of these at home for a complete review just as soon as possible. See all of you later.